Hello everybody. My name is Marina and you're listening to the podcast Maré Sonora. For those of you who don't speak Portuguese, Maré Sonora can be translated into resonant tide. Today's guest is Pat Lurcock from the UK. He's going to be talking about conservation in South Georgia, a very remote location in the Sub-Antarctic region. Welcome on board, Pat, and I'd like you to introduce yourself for our listeners who has never heard of you and tell us a little bit about your work in South Georgia.
Hello, Marina. Nice to talk to you. I'm very happy to talk about, the Rodent Eradication Project or anything else about South Georgia that I know about. So, yeah, happy to do that. Okay, well, when I left university, I joined the British Antarctic Survey and worked on one of the Antarctic bases at Halley for 2 years back in the 80s. After that, didn't really want to settle down back in the UK. And the first job that really came up after that was in the Falkland Islands. So I was married by then and we moved to the Falklands and lived there for 3 years. I was working for the Fisheries Administration. And during the end of that time, a job appeared in South Georgia, which was too good an opportunity to miss. So I went there initially for 4 months to do harbour and shipping and fisheries administration for 4 months and ended up doing it for 25 years. So I've spent all my working life so far down in the South Atlantic and Antarctic part of the world.
What's your professional background, Pat?
Oh, well, long ago, I did my degree in electrical and electronic engineering, of all things, which is how I got the job in the Antarctic as an electronics technician running equipment that was measuring and recording the Earth's magnetic field and putting that onto tape. And then I had to learn a bit of programming so that I could read those tapes back and make sure that the data was being recorded properly. And then having learned a bit of programming in that job, I then got the job in the Falkland Islands doing IT support and programming for the Fisheries Department. And during the 3 years there, I learnt how a Fisheries Department operates, how licensing, fishing licensing, harbour control, the biological data that's collected. There's a lot of information going to and fro in a fishery. So I had to learn how all the different departments worked to make the computers work for them. And then the South Georgia job came up, which was a very tiny fishery and harbour, which needed one person who could do all those different jobs. So I've moved sideways really from job to job to job and avoided a career in all this time.
Avoided a career.
Yeah, I think my mum's still wondering when I'm going to get a proper job.
Well, I guess our mothers can shake hands then.
Yeah.
For anybody who is listening and doesn't know much about South Georgia, what it looks like and sizes and so on, what can you tell us about the location, Pat?
Yeah, South Georgia, so it's about 900 miles east and a little bit south of the Falkland Islands. So it's there right at the southern part of the South Atlantic. It's about 90 miles long. So what's that? 150 kilometres long. At the widest, 10 miles, so 15 kilometres wide. And then it's mainly mountains. There's a big ridge of mountains along the middle of it. And that goes up to 2,900 meters, so very tall mountains. It's like the top of the Alps being cut off and just put on the sea. Very, very beautiful. And that's mountains and glaciers. And then just around the edge down at sea level, there's a little green fringe of tussock and small shrubs and a little bit of grass. And that's where the majority of the seals and the penguins and the birds can live and breed. And on that small island, there is a large number of breeding areas because the waters around it are very cold. They can hold a lot of oxygen, and there's a mix of nutrients from 2 different water bodies, 2 different seas mixed there. So it's very, very productive. Lots of food, and so the birds and the penguins and the seals can go and eat lots, and then there's a nice beach where they can come out and breed. So there's a lot of wildlife there. It's a very, very special place. And because humans have only been there for the last couple of 100 years, really only living there for the last 100 years, there hasn't been very much opportunity for it to get spoilt before we started protecting it. So it's still very special, very precious, and not had very much impact from human activity. So we haven't built great big roads and airports and factories and cities all over it. It's still very, very wild, and that's a really beautiful thing to be able to see.
Is South Georgia located in the Antarctic region or in the Sub-Antarctic, Pat?
It's Sub-Antarctic, so it's only about 55 degrees south, so the same as the northern parts of England. So not much further south than the tip of South America, but it's within the colder water. So the Antarctic Ocean, or the Southern Ocean that goes around the Antarctic, is a separate body of cold water, and that cold water extends around South Georgia. So it's very much part of the Antarctic ecosystem, but it doesn't have the Antarctic weather quite so much. So the sea doesn't freeze in the winter. Even in midwinter, there's 8 hours of daylight. So it's not the real full Antarctic, but you're very much part of the Antarctic ecosystem and sharing the same animals, so the seals and the penguins and the albatrosses.
How was it for you, Pat, to spend months and months in South Georgia? What was life like down there?
It was a very rare and special opportunity, which I was very glad to have and grasped it. I was very lucky that my wife, Sarah, accompanied me. So it wasn't like being away from everything you love. You could just concentrate on being there with an important job to do in managing the fishery and the environment. So feeling that you were contributing, but also having time to sit there amongst all the wildlife and to be part of a community of wildlife almost. So we're used to getting in the car or getting on the train and going lots of miles to go and see wildlife in special areas that we've allocated and decided that it's okay for the wildlife to be in. Whereas on a place like South Georgia or the Antarctic or the Falklands, you're sharing the wildlife's natural home. So it's outdoors where it chooses to be, and you have to fit in and amongst us. And that is an incredible privilege to have that different relationship with wildlife.
What was the longest period you were there without leaving the island?
The longest period on South Georgia was probably around a year and a half. The contracts that I did were generally, started off at 4 months, but then 8 months, 6 months with a gap. But every now and then I would have that gap and get involved in a different project. 1 year, we spent 3 months servicing the cemeteries at the old whaling stations. And another time I got involved in an expedition where we skied and walked the length of the island, and that took about a month. And then more recently, I spent 6 months on the island as part of the rodent eradication. But generally, we would be away from home. More usually, we'd be away from home for 6 or 8 months and then back to England for maybe 3 or 4 months.
A few months ago, you were a guest on the New Zealand Antarctic Society through a live transmission on YouTube, and I was very lucky to watch that. And I heard about your participation in the Rodent Eradication in South Georgia project. The talk was entitled Restoring South Georgia. I would like you to now, Pat, please tell us about that project you took part and what was that like and how did that happen? Explain that to us, what the project was about.
Yes, certainly. The Rodent Eradication Program took place over a number of years. So there were 3 baiting stages using helicopters to drop poison bait across large areas of the land in 2011, 13 and 15. That was to get rid of the rats that had arrived in ships over the last couple of centuries and which had taken hold on the island and were causing a lot of problems for ground nesting birds. There are no trees, so everything nests on or underneath the ground. So the small prions and petrels, pipits and ducks. And so their numbers were being kept way down by the rats. And so the South Georgia Heritage Trust and Friends of South Georgia Island formed this project. And then the part I got involved in, once the baiting was all over, we left it for 2 years until any remnant populations of rats will have built up to full capacity of any area they were in, and that makes them easier to find. And so we went in starting in October 2017, and we just travelled all over the island for 6 months, putting in bait stations with wax tags and tracking tunnels and just wooden stakes soaked in vegetable oil, a number of different things that the rats would be attracted to. And then we left them for a few weeks and then came back to see if they'd been chewed. And as we were going around checking all the devices, we also had a team of 3 specially trained dogs with us. So we spent 6 months travelling right around all the rat-infested parts of the island, looking very hard for rats and not finding any. So by the end of that, not only did we not find rats, but we saw a lot of evidence of recovery of the birds in everywhere we went. And as a result of that, we were able to be sure that the rodent eradication had completely succeeded, which is a really amazing project and really nice to have been there at the end to prove that it really had worked.
So the entire project lasted for how long?
Okay, the whole project lasted probably about 6 or 7 years. So there was one baiting phase in February, March, April of 2011. And that did just a small trial area. Although it was a trial, it was still the largest area that had ever been baited. And then they left it for 2 years while they were monitoring it just to make sure that had worked. And when they were sure that the technique worked, they then did another section of the island in early 2013, went away for 2 years, and then did the last section of the island in 2015. And because the island is broken up by large glaciers, it meant that they were able to go away and be confident that the rats wouldn't just reinvade from the next area along. So that was 2011, 13 and 15. And then over the southern summer of 2017 to 18, we did the project. So yeah, it's about 7 years from the start. And before they even started baiting, of course, there were 2 or 3 years of fundraising and organisation. So it's probably about 10 years, the whole project altogether.
You must have been to unreal places that many of us has never dreamed of or will never have the chance to visit. What about the challenges, Pat, that you faced during the project? What can you share with us?
Yeah, a lot of special moments. South Georgia is a special place and it's difficult to travel around to many places. So this project gave me and the team I was in a legitimate reason to go to every little bay and beach and hillside around the island. So I visited about 80 places, and altogether there were about 120 that we covered. And that in itself is a treat, because when I was working there, we're really in the little settlement almost all the time, where there's a bunch of scientists and a couple of government officers. So there's buildings and people and generators and man stuff, but you don't have to go very far, and then suddenly you're operating in a complete wilderness with no roads, no electricity, no mobile signal, no nothing. So you really are on your own. And that's probably the big challenge nowadays, is people are so used to being connected, and if you run out of something, you just get on the phone and you order it. Once you're on a little island down in the Sub-Antarctic, if you realise you haven't got enough food, or you haven't got enough batteries or anything, or something breaks, you can't just get it. You have to make do with what you've got. So put a good team together of resourceful people, good tools and equipment, and a lot of mending things and being resourceful to find different ways to solve problems, and just to keep your focus on what you're really trying to do and make sure that you manage to do that okay. When you're in the field, it's the little things that become important over a long time. So just keeping yourself clean and healthy and well fed. You can go camping for a weekend and just get dirty and eat rubbish, and you'll be okay. But just in the field long term, you've got to be healthy, hygienic, and we had to do good medical training in advance in case we had any problems. We didn't really have any. Well, I suppose the one medical problem we had, in fact, was what we called tussock fever, which is very like hay fever, the tussock grass that grows around the edge of the island. We were there during its pollen season, and we all suffered a bit with sinuses swelling up from the pollen there, which is something that had never happened in all the years I lived there, but we were spending much more time in the grass and so exposed to it more. Another little setback, I got bitten by a fur seal. That's an occupational hazard. And so, again, part of the training we do is knowing how to deal with, it was just a little scratch, but you've got to be really careful. The seals have very poor oral hygiene. So we had to make sure we cleaned the wound properly and put a dressing on it, and then put me on some decent antibiotics. And then after that, it was fine. It wasn't a deep bite or anything. But you've got to be ready and watch out for wildlife. Other real challenges were the weather, not so much with the monitoring, we were quite lucky, but with the baiting phases, they were in camps, tented camps, and as it got into the winter, there were blizzards and snowstorms, and they woke up one morning with the tents half covered in snow and had to dig themselves out. In South Georgia, it's not that far south, so it tends not to be nice, dry, cold snow. It's sort of wet, warm snow, which is the worst sort that gets in everywhere and sucks all the heat out of you. And those guys were just sitting there waiting for a good weather break so they could get the helicopters up. So it was an amazing challenge that they were able to rise to and keep focused so that when the weather improved, they were okay and ready to go. Another problem they had was in a big windstorm, two of the helicopters, they had to leave guide down on a beach when the ship took the third helicopter and hid in a bay. And when they went back after the storm, the wind had been so strong that it had damaged one of the helicopters so badly that it had broken one of the main rotor blades. The other helicopter was a bit damaged. It had just been scraped around a bit. And again, being resourceful, the engineers looked at that and they spent a few hours taking bits off one helicopter and putting it back on the other. And in the end, they were able to make one working helicopter from the two broken ones. And in fact, were able to move the rotors from one across to another, and eventually flew both of the damaged ones one at a time back to the ship, where they could then make one good helicopter, which meant they had two left, which was able to let them keep on doing the project, because with only one helicopter, you've got no safety backups. They wouldn't have been able to operate. So that was almost a showstopper, but thank goodness the engineers were able to think on their feet and be creative and make a working helicopter from those two broken ones. So yeah, it's all about being ready to deal with those situations when they come up.
One thing that I found very curious when watching your presentation on the YouTube channel was the fact that you used peanut butter to catch the rats. How exactly was it, Pat?
Yes, rats love peanut butter. So the baiting we were doing on the monitoring, we had little monitoring stations, which are a little wooden stake, which is maybe 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters and maybe 60 centimeters tall, with a pointed end, and that's driven into the ground. And we painted vegetable oil onto that. Rats have front teeth which continually grow, so they need to gnaw and chew on things to wear their teeth away. And with no trees or anything on South Georgia, if you put some nice wood out, they really love that. They can go and have a good chew, especially if it's got nice tasty vegetable oil on it. Then attached to those sticks, we also put a wax tag, which was impregnated with peanut butter, and a little corrugated cardboard, well, it's corrugated plastic square with peanut butter shoved up the corrugations. And we had to make those squares and put the peanut butter in. And by the end of a few weeks of making those and putting them out, everything that we had smelt of peanut butter, and I don't think anyone has really voluntarily eaten peanut butter since. But it was worth it. It meant that we had some very attractive things, and the chances were, if rats were there, they would have been attracted to it. And because we found no sign of them, we could be confident that it had succeeded.
If I had to ask you in terms of numbers of rats on the island, is it possible to say how many were there before the rat eradication project took place?
No, nobody really knows, because the rats, they lived in burrows underground, very difficult to get any idea of how many there were. We put out a team of scientists before the baiting started to trap rats in all the different areas to get DNA genetic samples from the different populations to make sure that they were separate populations. And they were out October, November, December, January, and had very little success. And it wasn't until the end of the summer that they were working that they were able to catch rats. So we think the rats probably over the winter dropped in numbers a lot and then bred up from almost nothing every year. So numbers varied a lot. But just from seeing the reductions in the number of birds compared to a few rat-free areas, we knew there were a lot, particularly by the end of the summer, over most of the island. But very difficult to say how many. So the baiting had to take a worst case scenario and put lots of poison down everywhere just to make sure that there was enough for a really dense population of rats in various places. I should probably mention that the poison in use was directed at rats. So they tended to find the pellets and take them into the burrows underground, which is what rats do. They'll stash food when they find it, and then they would eat it. And the cunning part of the design of the poison was that it took a couple of days before it had an effect. So they would then start feeling ill, but they wouldn't associate it with that tasty snack they'd had 2 days earlier. So by the time the poison was having an effect, the rats were already down in their burrows with a big stash of food. One aspect that the poison has is it makes them sensitive to light, so they don't want to go out into the daylight, so they just stay in their burrows feeling uncomfortable and keep eating their new stash of food. So most of the corpses and the carcasses stayed underground, which is great because it meant they weren't available to scavenging birds. A few scavenging birds, such as the skuas and the ducks, would take some of the poison. So we did lose a few birds, but not as many as we were prepared to put up with. And a year later, so many more birds were successfully breeding that it had been worth losing a few to get rid of the rats.
So the last question for this first episode is, what are the explanations for the presence of rat on South Georgia, Pat? What can explain that?
Well, back in the 1700s, 1800s, and even into the 1900s, most ships had rats on board. It was just the nature of the seagoing life. And the areas, particularly the outlying areas, places like South Georgia and the Antarctic and Little Islands, weren't very well charted. Sailing ships didn't have the opportunity to just stick an engine on and get out of trouble if the wind picked up. So you go to stormy areas, you're really at the mercy of the weather. So there were a lot of shipwrecks. And when those shipwrecks occur on a beach or on rocks near an island, the rats can swim ashore, and there they suddenly find there's lots of good food, nice soil they can burrow into. And so it was a very favourable habitat, so they survived very well. And once they're ashore, then they found they had no competition for food, etc. So they were able to do very well and thrive in most areas. Further south in the Antarctic, there were shipwrecks as well, but it's just that much colder, not a good habitat and not such good food year round. So any rats that had washed ashore in the Antarctic didn't survive. So further south is not a problem. South Georgia is that further north with a better climate. So the rats were a problem there.
You just heard the first episode with Pat Lurcock talking about conservation in South Georgia. Stay tuned because we come back next week with the second and final episode of this series. If you like this episode, don't hesitate to share with your friends, and please follow our podcast in your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify, Google, or Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. I wish you a great week and see you next Monday.